Did anybody else have trouble getting onto the City of Englewood's website because of privacy or security settings? Interesting. My MacBook wouldn't let me log on to the city's website. Oh, well.
Hey everybody, we'll go ahead and get started for tonight. And I'm just going to simply turn it over to Chris and we'll start our conversation about walkability and street design. So plenty of staff is online tonight from Englewood. So if you have any questions of staff as well, we're here to answer and help you through the discussion. So take it away, Chris.
Thanks, Wade. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. As Wade mentioned, we're kind of branching into our second topic on walkability. We had the last two sessions, we talked about parking and how it impacts walkability. And again, these are the 5 main themes under your code assessment and priority topics to discuss. And so we broke walkability into 2: parking policy and then street design specifically. Just to give you a bit of a roadmap of where we're going and where we've been. This is a list of the meetings we've already had, tonight being the walkability, street design, and then upcoming topics that we anticipate addressing by end of the year, start of next year, get into sustainability, and then several housing related topics on neighborhood character and design, housing options, and then housing attainability. And those we're going to try to coordinate with any information the city staff has on the grant. So this will get us through the 5 main topics of that code assessment that are priorities to address. Not that they're everything that we will address, but they've been established as priorities by you all and other groups as well. And then the goal is to basically get a pretty high level direction like we did with parking from this group and your discussion. And then that will set us up for the beginning of the next year to start doing a more robust public engagement on specific issues and topics. So while these conversations are going on, we're also doing our sort of independent review of the development code against your comp plan. And so those 2 tracks will kind of align so that the first of the year we begin a larger engagement with different stakeholders, public information meetings, things like that, that set us up for then eventually drafting sections of the code in February through August. So the important thing here is, A, we don't have any predetermined notions of how the code will be changed other than ideas, and we want to be incorporating your ideas. And then also, we don't feel like we have to resolve everything in these conversations, and you will see all of these topics come back in a coordinated manner in draft codes throughout next year. So for example, a lot of what we discuss about streets or housing is going to impact some of the parking discussions we had as well. So they're all of these issues are connected in some way or another. So that's our approach to the code. Any questions on that before we move on to tonight's topic?
Chris, yeah, I'm sorry. This is Michelle. I have a question. And this may be on the city's website. For whatever reason, my MacBook wouldn't let me log into the city's website for security reasons. But is this schedule of what we're talking about in the meetings, is it on the Code Next website, or is it somewhere that I can get?
Yeah, we will get it. We have an engagement strategy that we've been working with staff that's starting to schedule these things, but this is the first time we've put it in this sort of format as we sort of evolved into this schedule. So short answer is, yeah, we'll get it on the website in a number of formats for you.
Okay, people have been asking me questions, what we're going to talk about next, and I didn't have an answer for them. So, okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, and we didn't either, really, to be honest, other than we knew we were going to address those 5 topics, but we hadn't kind of organized it in this fashion. So it's a timely question, and we'll get that information more broadly disseminated.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts on the big picture? Okay, as I mentioned, so oh, go ahead.
I got a question on it's not really a question, it's a request, I guess. The phase 1 questionnaire, has that been distributed? And if it hasn't, can we have that distributed to the Planning and Zoning Commission? The results of that questionnaire?
We haven't done a questionnaire up to this point. Can you help me out with?
Somewhere in the presentation tonight, it talks about a phase 1 questionnaire. So we'll eventually get to that tonight. So that's what I was wondering about. Well, when we get there, I'll point it out.
Okay. Just raise your hand again, and then we'll talk about it when we get to that point.
All right. Thank you.
So this is just a graphic representation of that schedule that shows us kind of beginning to still in the fact-finding, information gathering and discussion phase, and then really beginning some of the drafting and putting strategies and solutions together throughout the beginning and mid part of next year. So why does street design matter? If you remember back in our kickoff meeting when we talked about our approach to codes, we do take a design-based approach, and that was what your plan and your code assessment suggested, that more regulations on building form, community design. And so from our perspective, it all starts with the streets. The streets set the context for a lot of different things, and the design of the streets will tell us a lot of what we can expect from development. So in our mind, it's critically important to let us know what's a reasonable way for the regulations to request or require the development to respond. So it sets the context and relationship of projects to the street are crucial. So it goes from streetscapes to frontages. Then we begin talking about building scale and mass and how places come together. And then the last part about it becomes, building design, what a building actually looks and feels like when you experience it. But again, it all starts with the streets in our mind, and with walkability being a key goal in the community, it even more so starts with streets. So what does your development code say? And just to be honest, not a lot, which isn't necessarily bad, but it does create some questions for us and things that we need this committee to discuss. It's addressed in 2 main places in the development code. If you're familiar with it, it's in there's a section in 16.6.3 that just talks about access and sites that talks about streets at a number of different scales, but it's clearly a section that was geared more towards site access, but then begins talking about vehicles and pedestrians and talks about streets. And then it's also listed in 1687, which is your subdivision regulations, where that's where we most often find streets addressed in development codes. One key point to bring out that's, I mean, I'm sure obvious to all of you, subdivision regulations deal with building and designing streets when you plat property and laying them out for the first time. You won't be doing a lot of that because you're essentially a built out community and a lot of your streets are built. So it's not, you're not in a situation where we will be regulating the design of streets into existence through subdivision regulations, but we also do want to make sure the development code is coordinating with street design for a number of reasons that we'll hit on during the discussion phase. The second place that the code addresses streets, the development code refers to the design and construction specifications. And so that's a separate document, in sections 1-2-3 and 1-2-12 talk about street design. And the good news here is they coordinate. We often run into cities where those two documents don't coordinate, and we'll find different things that conflict. And so those need to be reconciled. At least in your case, those two documents are kind of singing from the same sheet of music. There's a little bit more in the design and construction specifications and standards, a little bit more details than you have in the development code. One of the ways we typically approach street design is that the development code should have a lot of the urban design features of streets, whereas the design and construction specifications should have a lot of things of how you technically build and construct the infrastructure. So you find a lot more engineering specifications, construction standards there, whereas in the development code, you'd find a lot of more planning and urban design things, and that's where those two issues meet. There's no right answer to it, but as long as those documents are coordinated, that's what will be most important. Then each of those documents also references other planning documents that I'll talk about in a moment on the next page, but it sets at least the idea that there's other guides that will shape street design than just the development code. One of the reasons that's important is the development code really does not have a lot of information. It does coordinate with the design and construction specifications, but really all it has is right-of-way width, roadway width, and then sidewalk widths. And those sidewalk widths are fairly minimal, not sufficient in a lot of cases, but these are minimum standards. So it's not that you have plenty of streets that go beyond these standards. But our observation is you don't have a lot of guidance of when you would do something different or beyond these standards. So we know that in a lot of cases, the sidewalk widths are going to be too narrow if you just did the minimum. We know in a lot of cases that where and how the sidewalk feels is as important or more important than the width. And we just don't have a lot of guidance or cues in your development code. And it does refer to these other documents. And so then if we're going to improve on those standards, the question is, what will we go by? So Englewood has several plans and policies that give us some cues, but again, in our assessment, not quite enough information to put together a really good approach that builds expectations on street design. So you have the walk and wheel master plan that talks about all of these policies in a big picture. And I believe there's a scope that it's being updated right now. So that will be something that we would want to coordinate with as well. But I think the last one was a 2015 dated plan. There's a complete streets toolbox that includes a lot of the ideas that we're going to go over tonight. But it doesn't have it. One, it's limited to the downtown redevelopment area and that more walkable core, and doesn't have a lot of application outside of downtown, even though some of the ideas might. And then it also is just a list of techniques without a lot of specifications and measurements and dimensions. So it kind of leaves us off with, okay, what dimensions are we talking about and how should development respond to these designs? Another source of information is the comprehensive plan. There's a lot of information about having multimodal corridors and designating where those are and which one those are, and then your specific plans, mainly the downtown plan, but some of the other specific topical or area plans have addressed street design in some capacity. So that tells us that we're probably going to want to look to some other industry best practices to help us if those documents aren't giving us enough guidance on how to improve street design through the standards. So that leads to what is the state of the profession? And here I'm talking about planning and urban design primarily. Although I think some of these ideas are endorsed by transportation planning and traffic engineering as well. But the document we find as the most kind of forward thinking on these issues is the National Association of City Transportation Officials, or NACTO. They have a really good resource on their website that a lot of these ideas come from. And it seems to have a really good balance of traffic, transportation planning, and urban design. And we think that's really relevant to a lot of cities, but in particularly relevant to Englewood in your situation. Because as I mentioned, a lot of your streets are platted, existing, and built to a large extent. But the main things this NACTO, how it's advancing our thinking and discussion of transportation and street design, is it starts off with recommending transitional street design. And by that, it means the street itself, the design and cross section you experience when you're on foot or driving through it or biking through it, should transition from block to block even, or over several blocks, based on the context of the land uses it's supporting, even though the functional class of that street might be the same. So by functional class, I mean there's, from a transportation planning standpoint, streets are often grouped into arterials, ones that are highly continuous or might have high volume, collectors, streets that might feed into that system and have shorter distances, and then the local streets, the one where we mainly are getting access from. But what NACTO is suggesting is don't let that functional class dictate the design of the street. There's other issues related to the context that will become important. And Broadway is a great example to think of that. It does transition along its course based on the context it's in. The other design principles that this document promotes are these 4 points. Streets are public spaces first. So we should think of them that way. They really shape your community. We've seen statistics where right of way and streets are as much as 25 to 40% of the land area of a city. So it's crucially important to shaping your character. It's basically designing a quarter or a third of your city if you get the street design right, even if we aren't talking about private development. Streets generate great economic value, and in particular you do that through the design. It's becoming more and more prevalent that these types of investments that we'll be talking about can really pay great returns to the community, particularly since you don't need a lot of this. Broadway, again, being an example, it's a great street section for a few blocks, and that's a powerful economic engine. Streets as ecosystems. So again, as something that's laid out as a continual connected system. People are revisiting the environmental benefits of that linked system. How can we get streets to address stormwater? How can we get streets to have more green infrastructure incorporated into it, since it is a connected system? And then lastly, existing streets can be changed. We have lots of examples from big picture interventions to small interventions. And so that's important to Englewood, again, because your streets are largely established. The third point they advocate is lane widths should be, rather than coordinated to that functional class, they should be coordinated to the desired speeds, because vehicles and drivers behave based on the cues that they're given. So the wider the lanes, the faster we can expect cars to be traveling. Related to that, the fourth point is a concept called good friction, that what's going on the edges of the street needs to be coordinated with the behavior we expect traffic to be behaving. So things like parking, street trees, and bicycle lanes, sometimes competing interests, but things that can narrow the street in a good way and get things coordinated. So it's a concept to be considered. And then the last, generous sidewalks opposed to minimum. So thinking of sidewalks as both a transportation element and social spaces. So again, the NACTO document has a lot of more information on that. I think the biggest point takeaway for this project to be thinking about is that first one, that different streets for different contexts, and the standards don't necessarily emphasize that right now. And I think it'll be an important tool as we consider how the development regulations respond.
Chris, we have a question from Christine.
Yes. Thanks. This all sounds good. I'm on board so far. Lots of exciting ideas in there. To the degree that we can address new street design here in the UDC, I'd like to consider adding in bike lanes. I noticed that in our existing standards, we have the right-of-way width the roadway width and sidewalk width, but we don't have bicycle lanes in there. So I hope we could consider that. They really can't go on the sidewalk. I think that's actually illegal, and you don't really want them mixing in with the cars, especially if it's kids. So I hope we could keep that in mind in the bigger picture as we look at street design.
A great segue, because that's exactly what we're going to talk about running through these next scenarios. The 4 things we think are essential, as I mentioned, and you point out, the street standards don't have a lot of the urban design features. Excuse me. A lot of the urban design features that shape the different character of streets. So lane width, on-street parking, bicycle lanes, and the landscape amenity are the 4 main things. And we have some dimensions in your code, but there's not a lot of what's going on within those dimensions. And so these are some things that we've drawn out of that NACTO document that can start to give us clues. Again, if we don't have the dimensions in your policy manuals, is there a decision-making tool that needs to be built in that tells us how to reconfigure some of these spaces as development occurs? So the first one being lane widths, and the lesson learned is coordinate lane widths with the desired speed. And so these dimensions seem to be coming up, that less than 10-foot lanes, you're wanting very slow speeds, and particularly on neighborhood streets. The 10-foot lane is the more kind of generally applicable lane width for reasonable speeds that mix multimodal transportation. When you get up to 11 or 12 feet, you're generally talking about priority routes that should be either that wide of lane to handle larger vehicles that are expected, whether it's a truck route or transit route, and larger vehicles are going to be frequent. And that's when the wider lanes, and then the last being the 12-foot lane, you really only want that if your priority is to move traffic and as much traffic as fast as you can. And so the lesson learned there is what we often find in codes is 12 foot's usually listed as the minimum. So it's sort of flipping that idea on its head of on certain streets, we might want to be thinking of your lane widths a little bit differently, depending on the context we're going through. The second one is on parking, that good friction. So typical widths that we see would be on a residential street, 6 to 7 feet, on a commercial street, 7 to 8 feet. And angled parking, if it were a situation that you had enough right of way, anywhere from the 14 to 20 feet, depending on what's the angle of the parking and where is that car backing into. Is it backing into a moving lane, or is it backing into a secondary lane? So all of those decision points go into that. I think the one point to note here is that on the residential, using a 6 to 7 foot lane, it kind of accounts for the idea that the average car is usually between 5.5 to 6.5 feet wide. So the 6 to 7 is, you might say, well, that's not enough space. But I think on the residential streets, it's assuming that you're using a lot of the curb space is being absorbed, and the fact that the traffic volumes are low and there's not as many conflicts, and the doors entering into traffic is not as many conflicts. So that width seems sufficient to account for and balance all of those things. Again, not in every case, but it's just a rule of thumb. And then in the commercial settings where you do expect frequent on-street parking and frequent traffic, that extra cushion to at least get the entire parked vehicle absorbed in that parking lane is important. Parking lanes obviously compete in priority with the other issue that's lacking and was already mentioned, the bicycle parking or bicycle facilities, and some general rules of thumb there. The main one is that what's important here is comparable speeds. So the issue of bikes on sidewalks, not a good idea. Those aren't very comparable speeds when you're thinking of bike as transportation. People walking at 2 to 3 miles an hour and a bike at anywhere from 10 to 15 miles an hour, that's a conflict. That's a too great a speed differential. And so when you move them into the street, there's these rules of the higher the traffic, the more protection you would need. And certainly these widths are typical from everything from no facility, because it's a tame enough street that bikes and cars should comfortably mix, whether that's due to street speed of the vehicles or low volume, or it's a side street situation, to the ones where you start to see the Sharrow term, which I think was actually coined by the city of Denver, that maybe has some baggage with it, depending on which camp you're in on the bike transportation, but at least it's a strategy to be considered when you might not have enough space for a dedicated facility and the speeds are low enough that giving the bikes that extra cushion and making sure it's signed and posted can accommodate bikes. But then the ideal is really a dedicated lane, and anywhere from 5 to 7 feet. And that depends on, is it a curb edge where there is no conflict with the parking, or is it a situation where you're abutting the parking and there's concerns about door openings and things like that? But that 5 to 7 foot dedicated lane seems to be the sweet spot. And then anytime you get speeds over 40, we're really talking about a pretty significant comparable speed conflict. So there should either be a protected lane, off-street facility, or something like that. So again, just rules of thumb to help us figure out what we can do with the limited amount of space we have. Landscape amenity. We think this is a critically important for the green infrastructure element that I mentioned. Also a really good feature in terms of urban design and placemaking, offering the shade and comfort. But then also it's one of those good friction cues. So streets that have that vertical element close to the street are shown to slow cars down more than streets that don't. It's that behavioral cues. So getting street trees in wherever you can is important. And again, with constrained space, there's some rules. If it's under 4 feet of landscape area, you're probably not going to, it's probably not worth it to put the tree in, or even the landscape amenity. It just becomes a maintenance liability. When you get 4 to 6 feet, it's best for small shade trees. So on constrained right-of-ways, that's a good strategy. But the ideal to get larger shade trees is ideally having 6 to 10 feet of space. If you have a really important street or one that's you want a high degree of urban design amenity, 10 feet plus, to have a good landscape element. This is also serving as a buffer from the sidewalks as well, getting pedestrians removed from the vehicle and moving traffic is a good idea. And I know whether to do an attached or detached sidewalk is always a debate in communities because of the logistics of constructing it and also the space. And one of our rules of thumb for that is, if you have on-street parking, those are the best streets to have the attached sidewalk, because it makes sense that the cars are already serving as that, parked cars are serving as that buffer, and people getting out of the cars can then alight onto a sidewalk rather than a landscape area. But we understand that you don't always have that space or that luxury to do that. So these are just some of the good rules. The other part about trees, our landscape architect is constantly counseling us that regardless of the space, whether you have just enough, not enough, plenty, what's really going to dictate how well trees do is how they're planted, composition of the soil and subgrade. So they're big on you can get a great street tree in anywhere. It's just a matter of how you prepare the area and plant it. But again, thinking of the space in this dimension can help us. And then the last element are the sidewalks. And again, your code has a minimum 4 for residential, which we think is actually deficient because it's not enough for people to walk side by side, and a minimum of 5 for commercial, which based on this chart isn't really producing the kind of environment you want for a walkable commercial area. But we use these rules of thumb to just kind of escalate what are we trying to do with the sidewalk, going from just enough on a residential street, just enough on a commercial or low volume street, all the way up to the types of sidewalks where you would see outdoor seating and people lingering and lots of community value from the space. So those numbers can get quite high, but I'm sure you have some of those. We haven't gone out and measured off Broadway, but I wouldn't be surprised if you've got segments of it that are in that 16 to 20 range as well. So with those rules of thumb, what does it mean to how we think about the code specifying it and how we think about development responding to it? So this would be just an image of what could happen under your current standards. This would meet the standard for arterials, minimum right-of-way width, minimum roadway width, and then a sidewalk with not a lot of guidance of where any of those parts should go. Whereas we might see segments of the streets that should look like this. Maybe that roadway should be used for 2 through lanes and a turn lane and on-street parking. And then you can fit the bike lane with the parking buffer in it, and a larger amenity zone and a sufficient sidewalk. So that all fits within the space which is specified in the right of way. And again, not that every street would be this, but if we want to start to follow the cues of getting different street designs for different contexts, we should start thinking about some of these principles. Similarly, for the standard local street, this is the a minimum right-of-way width, minimum sidewalk, and then a roadway width, which is fairly wide. It's 36 feet, and not a lot of what's supposed to happen within that space. So we just put in the parking and the lanes according to that rule of thumb, and you have a lot of leftover space on these streets with that standard. So this is one way to think of that space and rearranging it, and this would take some of those amenities and actually expand them out. So you in the 50-foot right of way with the 36-foot wide street, you can't fit these things. So this would bump up to a 60-foot right of way, kind of adding to the outside, but we're still kind of left with that wider street in the middle. So then we did another scheme that took that 50-foot right of way and simply rearranged it. And I think you have several streets that follow this cross section. It's a 28-foot wide, and from our kind of Google Earth rough math, we were able to find several of your local streets that did have this quality, even though it didn't meet the minimum code, which would suggest that the street needs to be 36-foot wide on a local street. But having different solutions for different contexts, this would be a 50-foot right of way that apportions the street to some of those things. The other thing to point out here is you can kind of start to see the approach to bicycle lanes and parking and where you balance that. This one suggesting that they merge because it would be a slow, low volume street, and therefore a bike facility wouldn't be needed and more frequent on-street parking could be done. There would certainly be other streets, whether it's a priority bicycle route or whether it's just too busy to have the bikes and cars merging, that you would see the parking disappear and a bike lane go in that place. So those are all kind of decisions that can happen on a context by context basis to get better street design things. And again, we can, to the extent that your transportation plans and policies haven't accounted for these things, they're not difficult to build in some simple rules of thumb to help us and give us cues. It may not answer the question for a standard for every single situation, but it can begin to set up a decision-making process. So we've built things like this into development codes where it may not spit out a specific cross-section, but it would spit out a thinking process of how we utilize that 50-foot right-of-way, 60-foot right-of-way, or 80-foot right-of-way, depending on the context and some of these balancing priorities. That's kind of really all I have to introduce the topic and discussion. We did throw together some things, just our observation of what we think we want to accomplish with street design in the development code, particularly because of your guys' unique situation that you aren't often platting new streets, but we do really believe the development code needs to be addressing these topics in the event that you do, but we also want some document guiding the design of these spaces so that we have an answer for when some of these things need to be coordinated with development. So our objectives, we think one, we want to better coordinate the development code with other standards and outside guidance rather than just kind of punting to them. We want to make sure we know what's in those as well, so that they're all speaking from the same speaking the same language and accomplishing the same goals. We do believe that we need more specific guidance for different contexts so that we can answer what's going on within some of those spaces. And then the last question is how will this be implemented? And we came up with 3 scenarios that we would often find happening in the development code. The first, reactive. So in other words, a larger scale development project happens, and we want them to make right-of-way improvements because of their impact, or they're going to be redoing the street anyway, or they're developing a sufficient capacity that it's time to upgrade the street. So when, where, and how that would happen would be answered in the development code. And then what they put in would need to be coordinated with the development code. The second scenario is proactive. So when will right-of-way improvements be viewed as an incentive for the types of development or anticipated development that the city wants to see? So it's often the case where even though it seems like a really big, large, expensive thing to redo a street, comparably to when developers are asking for incentives, if you do the ledger on redoing a streetscape and the benefit that can provide to that project, it's really a pretty good return on investment for the city. It's often far less than development incentives they might be asking for. So if it's as simple as hey, we're going to redo the streetscapes, the rest is on you. If you build a really great context, sometimes that's enough to encourage the types of development you want. And the last is just a more strategic approach that as the city ticks off some of its priorities where there's deficiencies, or where larger transportation plans need to be invested in, how is the development code going to correspond with all of those decisions that are also being made regarding the design of the right of way? So with that, I'll open it up to any thoughts, questions, or observations you all have on street design.
Kate Townley?
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate you talking about streets as places for people and not just cars, and that they do have a big economic benefit as well. I guess a few questions or thoughts in terms of sidewalk widths, and I realize what we have are minimums. I would be concerned that whether or not we're meeting ADA requirements, even with a 4-foot sidewalk, I would think you would probably need at least a 5-foot sidewalk to meet those or have passing spaces. So it seems like there would definitely be room for increasing those minimum widths across the area. And I think that also goes into just the general idea of comfort and sort of the what works, what can we get by with versus what makes people comfortable enough to actually walk and bike places and do that across the ages and across different mobility levels as well. So one of the things in looking at the slide on the bike lanes and protected bike lanes and the variations of speed and things like that, which is critical to think about. But I think, 40 miles an hour plus to have a protected bike lane, those are really fast moving cars. And I don't know if I personally would be a lot more comfortable having more protected bike lanes, even with cars going at a lower speed next to people. And I think that there's been more research coming out with that, showing the return on investment and, the higher use of more lanes that are actually protected and separated from cars versus just a dedicated lane. And my personal opinion, I don't even think sharrows should be an option because I don't think they do anything. So I would want to just get rid of those, and that we should expect bikes on every street. So I definitely appreciate all those, different suggestions. I'm wondering, what is the role of the city traffic engineer or transportation engineer in terms of, like, we put in best practices, refer to NACTO or things like that, and then it's essentially would be still up to the engineer whether or not they get implemented. So I guess that would be one question. And I was thinking if I had another question, I guess, and another question I would have, and you can address this later, at least the experience I've had on my street is that the street is wide enough for cars parked on both sides. And this is just a residential street, and for 2 cars to pass each other driving. And then the right of way extends 10 feet up past the sidewalk into the yard. So just like, do we have a sense of how much right of way we actually are working with within the city? Because that's a huge asset to have that much land within the city to potentially be working with.
Yeah, a lot of great comments there. I'll try to make sure I address them all. The first one, or the last one, I guess, the right of way, we are working with staff to try and get some math on that, or maps with the math to know, how many streets do we have where there just isn't the right of way to do this, and therefore to do some of these different things, you would be looking at either a retrofit of the existing street or a reconstruction of the street, which may or may not be feasible, versus some of the more sort of tactical strategies that some planters and some paint can help accomplish some of the goals. So we're trying to get an assessment on the right of way width of different street sections beyond just our observations from the Google surveys and things like that. And I think this Public Works Department has some of that information, and we'll get it. That kind of relays into your one of your questions was, well, if we get some of these policies and principles in, who decides? And I think that's a fair question. That's what goes back to our first point of, regardless of what's where some of these ideas live, we would want both documents, the development code, which is usually first encountered by the planning department and planning commission, versus the design and construction standards, which is usually first encountered by public works or the traffic engineer. We want those two things to be communicating. With regard to who would ultimately make the final call if some of these things end up into more guidelines of options and opportunities, I think we would probably just need to talk with staff and figure out what's the best way to work through some of those goals and objectives and get the right solution. But I think that does hit on one thing, and we actually talked with Public Works last week, and I think one of the things that came out in our mind is people just want to have something that helps them give a right answer, whether it's planning or Public Works. So I think we'll get there on some of those other questions. And then to your last point on the bike lanes, completely agreed with your points on the Sharrow and the protected lane and those things. So I mean, our radar and sensitivity is up on that. And in fact, at some points, I think it might even be best just to refer to NACDO. They seem to have the best guidance in terms of balancing some of the competing interests and coming up with designs that work well on, when you should separate the transportation facilities, even to, there's a whole range of different facilities that have standards from, this just includes lanes, and then we say, well, at some point it's an off-street facility or a protected lane. Well, there's 100 variations of those things as well, whether you're talking about a multi-use off-street trail, whether it's a trail incorporated into the right-of-way that's buffered with a landscape, or whether it's a two-way bikeway that's in the right-of-way and a part of the right-of-way is segmented off with a protected barrier. All of those things are tools and strategies to be considered. I would say we will quickly get out of our element in that regard, because from what I do know is that the facility and the street cross section is great, and they have some really cool things, but the intersection details, that's the note we put at the end, that's going to determine, that's one of the most important things on a bike system, is how do you interface with intersections at different places, and that usually drives a lot of the street cross section details. But I think maybe I addressed all of your good points, but if I didn't, let me know.
Chris, I think the one that she asked first was the minimum width regarding ADA.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And are we meeting that?
Yeah, and I think what's required of ADA and not, and when you're deficient, gets to be quite a complicated issue. But I would say going forward, you're right that 4 feet, it probably isn't going to, if it's a new facility going in, it's not going to meet it. Our point is that's probably not enough anyway. I mean, it's kind of like the stroller test, the wheelchair test, or the side-by-side people walking test. You got to have 5 feet, and then you go up from there. And then I think the ADA compliance becomes more of keeping clear zones and making sure there's proper details on intersection details and curb ramps rather than the width itself. I think that should probably take care of itself in an updated standard that just meets your general transportation goals. But it's certainly a good point to bring up and be aware of. Any other thoughts or questions or things we need to be aware of that you've encountered?
Christine?
What are other cities that are built out like ours doing in terms of attached sidewalks versus detached sidewalks? And if you have one house in the middle of the block that gets scraped and rebuilt, what do you do about that?
Yeah, that's one of the discussions we had with staff last week was, most of these projects, if it's a situation where the solution is a redesigned right of way, you usually got to address it on a block scale, unless it's something that's a one of those more interim strategies where perhaps it's, like I said, there could be things that have steps to that end solution. We're starting to look at some of those options, but there's no magic answer for that, unfortunately. But the worst scenario is a lot, just a one lot development, and the rest of the block doesn't have any impetus to change the cross section. Those will be really challenging. It might be a scenario where we start to come up with some priorities for where are your greatest deficiencies, and that it gets to that third one, the strategic amendments, really. Where are we having the most development activity or the most potential? Where are the greatest deficiencies? And can we come up with a system that's not just regulating them into existence, but it's more of an investment strategy that at some point we know, okay, this street's ready to elevate onto the CIP, and maybe it's a system where you have to pay into it as you go. There's opportunities. One of the things we started exploring was the assessment tools that the state offers of where property owners could begin to start to pool money for some of these upgrades through an assessment. That's what I know that our city has done that in several places where there's been older street sections that are deficient, that on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis or even a block by block basis, you can do assessments. Those can get pretty complicated, but they are sort of letting neighborhoods self-determine. So I think all of those options need to be on the table. And I don't know that in any one scenario there will be a great answer, but I think that's why we started to frame these in the reactive, proactive, and strategic. I think under each of those, there's probably going to be a whole list of options that we need to vet out as well.
Michelle?
Yes, Chris, just one thing. These are all really good ideas, and there is a lot of things you presented that would be wonderful if we could implement. I just want to put one little bug in your ear that Englewood's a little bit different from many cities, is your discussion about people banding together and perhaps making their own block improvements or something like that. Englewood, the vast majority of Englewood have alleys, and they're dirt alleys. So I'm just putting that little bug in your ear just because I'm not so sure most of Englewood would be banding together. I think they'd rather improve their alley rather than their street. I'm just trying to be an honest of what I hear. The alleys are one of the biggest complaints that I hear about all the time. So
I appreciate the heads up. That's good information.
Andy?
Yeah, I didn't know if this was the right section to talk about outdoor seating and where that would fit in some of this when it does have to extend into the public right of way.
Yes, that's a great topic, and that's kind of what we're referring to here. That the wider you are, the more opportunity you have for some of those social spaces. Not that you can't have those things on the narrower sidewalks, because they certainly exist. The development code, I don't know where that policy lives in the city's documents right now, but we often try to get the development code to coordinate with that wherever possible. I also think it's one of the areas where there's a lot of uncertainty from the property owners of what you can, in typical cities, what you are allowed to do, and a lot of misinformation of, well, that's not legal because of liquor laws, or that's not legal because of liability, and therefore you need to fence it all in, and then you don't want it fenced in because it's public space. So we're certainly willing to help with that, because I think it's an area that gets unnecessarily complicated by some of that misinformation. So we'll be willing to coordinate information, and the development code is a place to do that. I think we can do that, but we just want to be sensitive to other policies from other departments that might be lurking out there from, both liquor control, maybe finance might have some permits, and then obviously public works with controlling the right of way. Has there been any experiences or situations where that's been either a great success or been a challenge? I'd just be curious to know how often you run into that.
Kate Townley?
Thank you. Yeah, I would say that it would be good to make sure that we have like accommodations for benches and outdoor seating and have them be welcoming to folks. I was reading some article from China that you have to now, in one of their cities, put in a payment to use a bench in a park. And then after your time's up, these spikes come up and you have to go. And it's essentially to keep people moving. And the purpose really is to keep people, hanging out, and which often means they're, creating more connections and visiting businesses and things like that. So I think it's good to be considering those social spaces, like you mentioned, in these gathering spaces. And I guess on this particular slide that you have showing now, and I think something to think about with that is that we've heard through a lot of other, different feedback sessions, how important our parks are and how much people value parks, yet we don't have much more space to build new parks. And so really being able to think about these really wide right-of-way areas as places to actually be able to have linear parks and have more of those opportunities, have more opportunities for trees and shade and things like that, or benches for people to hang out in. And I think a question would be if we're able to suggest some of changes like that for the code, how that may impact whether it's public works or whether that would bring in parks and recreation, and if there's support as well from some of those other departments, if we were to create more of those social spaces or gathering spaces along different right-of-ways.
Any other thoughts or suggestions? One of the things I think we would expect to do is compile some of these comments and notes to add to this list of objectives and things we need to be coordinating to and getting back to you all with answers. But then also for the next meeting, coming back with sort of something that confirms the direction, or at least things you want us to be exploring, or at least where there is consensus on what we're trying to achieve, perhaps even helping direct the drafting already. But like I said, we want these discussions to build into our broader public engagement, both at the public level, but then also the technical committee level. You all have brought up a lot of things that will need to be coordinating between different departments. And so that's great. That's really helpful for us too. So.
Kate Townley?
I might as well ask one more thing. I guess one other thing, and I'm wondering about, in terms of coordinating and what's possible and all of that. And, the moving a curb can be very expensive, or impacting stormwater and things like that. So I don't know if the code is the right place for this, but where might there be opportunities to still narrow the right of way or narrow the lane widths and things like that without, moving the curb? We have an example of that, I think, with the mid-block crossing on Broadway is, creating a bump out, but they didn't actually move the curb and gutter. So can we still think about some of those things as we're, considering different sidewalk widths or street designs that may not, maybe at some point in time we have enough money to change the whole stormwater system and change the gutter system, but other things that we can do for now, or just other possibilities that may not be as, intensive in terms of changing big parts of the infrastructure.
Yeah, that's a great point for a couple of reasons. One, the cost of moving a curb, as I understand, is quite a lot. And then two, the impact on stormwater. We have already begun, because of your situation, but then we also run into this in other cities. We've been collecting examples of projects that deal with that situation. We haven't dug enough to know like which ones are great or not, or which ones are, cost benefit analysis is great or not. But just an observation is they usually seem to be done as a stormwater improvement. In other words, that it's not moving the curb, so the existing flow line functions like it would ordinarily, and the system's working, but it's also removing pavement and infiltrating stormwater in a way. And so there's like a triple benefit from those types of projects, because it's a traffic calming streetscape amenity, it's a cost benefit analysis, and then it's also removing pavement while at the same time infiltrating more stormwater. I don't know the details of what makes one of those projects right or not. All I know is they exist, and they might be something worth exploring for the city as well.
Christine?
Thanks. I agree with all that. And in cases where it is too expensive or not possible to move a curb or to expand the right of way, I would similarly be curious if there are streets where the existing lanes could be narrowed enough to fit in a narrow bike lane. And that made me curious when you said the minimum bike lanes are typically, I think you said 5 to 7 feet.
Mm-hmm.
Are there ever cases where it's a 4-foot bike lane? I was wondering how wide the Dartmouth one is. I don't know if any of you know. I know it's pretty skinny, but I also know I'm really glad it's there, even though it's skinny. I'd rather have a skinny, unprotected bike lane than be stuck in the sharrows.
Yes, I am aware of 4-foot ones, and I think some of the guidance in NACTO even says that in constrained areas that's acceptable. So yeah, and the other part, I think, one of the things about the bike lanes that would probably go beyond this project, and maybe it's with the coordinating with the walk and wheel plan, is I think there's a really big opportunity you have so much connectivity in your street network that prioritizing different streets for different functions would be a great idea. And maybe you're taking a local street that has a high amount of connectivity and finding a way to do a bike boulevard through it or something like that. Those are things that'll get into more transportation planning that are beyond the development code. But we're certainly going to want the development code to communicate with those ideas.
Whoops, Andy Taylor?
Yeah, while we're talking about context for different streets, I wouldn't want to forget our bus routes in Englewood, that we've got some important routes here, some that could see major improvements. So just those are some different contexts that I'm just wondering if you handle those specifically in some of these areas, and just how they connect to the street.
Yeah, I think we'll definitely want to have those. To me, that's a arterial collector, and that's where you go, well, if you're looking at different sections, you probably can't afford to narrow the lanes because those large vehicles need to be there. But it's also one where perhaps the curb space is really valuable to the transit agency. So on-street parking is one that quickly goes away. But then there's also other transportation services that are similar to transit that find that curb space valuable. The on-demand transportation services, whether it's Uber or Lyft, those types of things. So I think there is a multimodal, well, and the comp plan has the multimodal corridor. So I think there certainly is a multimodal section that needs to be developed that balances a lot of those interests and really prioritizes the pedestrian and the transit vehicle over everything else, because every transit ride begins and ends with a pedestrian. So you want those areas to be as pedestrian accommodating as they can, and that interface between the people and that transit vehicle to be as simple as possible.
Christine?
Thanks. Can you explain once again how all these pieces fit together in terms of what we're discussing here? How can that influence or become a part of other Englewood Department plans, I picture the UDC as being, as affecting individual houses that are scraped, individual commercial businesses that are built up. And like you said, we're a pretty built out city
Yeah.
as it is. So can you explain a little better how that fits into, or how our recommendations here for streets can get to the right places within Englewood between all the different plans and departments?
Yeah, and this will be my outsider's opinion without the benefit of going through with staff and the technical committee. But I think we can start right from this slide. Is, you know, on implementing, we know the development code is going to touch on street design in one of those three ways. Either the reactive one, where we're, because of a development project, they need to make the improvements; a proactive one where we want to suggest improvements that spur the type of development we're planning for in the development code, or that bigger picture idea. So from there, the next thing I would suggest is we've put these, so if a lot of these ideas really would benefit from a, you know, just a really thorough, detailed transportation plan. But the development code doesn't need a lot more than some of those rules of thumb I talked about to help at least give answers to some of these questions, or at least point us to where some of these conflicting priorities might come up. And so we have a better decision tree. And so this is, you know, just a one-page tool that we've put in development code, something similar to this. When we know that we're not gonna spit out the exact right cross section every time. So this could be another tool that either lives in the development code, is an appendix to the development code, or is something that's used to coordinate some of those separate documents. So that would be the second thing. And then I'll go back to this table right here. It's in the development code. So what I would see was it be an easy fix is that if we know that the sidewalk minimum needs to be bumped up, if we know that there's also a landscape amenity and a bike lane amenity that's missing from these typical streets, and if we know that the arterial street, for example, we might have a multimodal transit arterial, we might have a traffic moving arterial, and we might have a walkable, you know, slow street arterial. Well, it's very easy for this table to at least expand and give some of those parameters as well. So I think this is a given that this is in there now, and we want this to be just have some simple amendments that start to account for some of these things. It could then refer to that decision document that I had up, the colored matrix that starts to, you know, identify some of the trade-offs and decisions. It could end up in some basic cross sections that we know will work in most cases, and those go in here. But this table right now is exactly coordinated with the design and construction specifications, where most of the guidance is coming from. And so we would expect those two to coordinate when we're done with this as well, regardless of how, if there's just a few simple amendments to this table that get us going down the right path, or if it becomes a little bit more of a complicated table as well. I think it'd be pretty easy for those two documents to continue to coordinate. I think that the harder problem is that a lot of these discussions or bigger picture planning policies need to be addressed in these documents. But you know, without knowing an exact answer to your question, I think there's a few things that we know we can do as a bare minimum to get some of these ideas incorporated.
Kate Townley.
I guess this might be another question kind of around a coordination piece, or thinking about what the street standards and sidewalk standards would be, but how that relates to different setbacks. So the setbacks, we can, you know, be able to really address quite a bit through the development code. So, and sorry, I don't have this question formulated that well, but sort of maybe what comes first. And this might have to do also with whether you're being proactive or reactive to a situation. An example might be several years ago, we were looking at an overlay for Oxford Light Rail Station along Windermere Street. And so say you wanted to update that zoning or something like that and have it continue to be, or have it be 0 setbacks, because that would make it more walkable. not, in my opinion, it's not necessarily going to make it more walkable if you only have a 4-foot sidewalk. So how do you balance that? What comes first, the setback piece or the sidewalk piece?
That's a great question, but you just summed up exactly why we think this is such an important topic of the development code. The best way I can sum it up is, so this is a street that would, according to the code, would meet your standards. It's not a street where we would say, just like you described, it doesn't make sense to say that this should be a, have a walkable development pattern with buildings built right to the street, because the investment in the street doesn't warrant it. Whereas this street, and then particularly if that amenity zone filled in with some of the benching and seating, like you mentioned, would be the exact opposite. You would expect the development to be right up on the street, and you would in fact want to require it. So those are the exact cues that we want the development code to be responding to. Similarly, from a residential standpoint, a similar, you know, this would be a pretty good street to have a reduced setback and maybe houses tighter to the street. This one maybe not, and it's the ordinary larger setbacks where the front yard is the amenity. So that's the coordination that we want to achieve. The tougher question is which comes first. So there is certainly a chicken or the egg scenario that we're going to have to figure out. And that does go back to, you know, that host of strategies. What do we do when it's just one lot in a block versus a bigger picture fix? So those are all things that we'll need to collectively figure out.
Hey, I have a comment on that. This is Brooke. I'm a senior planner here, and yeah, I think some of our we changed some setback regulations many years ago to try and encourage buildings to come up to the street, to especially on places like Broadway, where we did not want parking lots in front of retail buildings. But I think in some cases, we didn't have enough right of way. And I'm not suggesting that the city try to acquire more right of way, but that sort of pushing or encouraging through our code businesses and development to come up to a 0 setback line, actually where there was not much room to do many things, has actually created some issues where we don't have enough room to do what we would like to do with our streetscapes. So, you know, if the goal is to not have parking in front of businesses in our commercial corridors, you don't need to take it to a 0 setback or a 5-foot setback or even a 10-foot setback. It takes 19 plus 20 something feet to create that. So it takes like 30 feet to do that. So we don't need to, there's some positive changes that can be made in some of our setbacks to encourage the streetscape and still adhere to you know, keeping businesses at the forefront and not putting parking lots at the front. So that's all.
Hey, Chris, do you ever run into any conflict when we talk about street design and say fire truck access widths and what they require? Is there anything that you've run into that we need to watch out for in that regard?
Yeah, that's a good point. We usually run into it on when we're suggesting or a community has a desire to do narrower neighborhood streets. So by that, I'm talking a street that's less than 28 feet wide with on-street parking on both sides. The NACTO guide talks about something which is called a yield flow lane. And what that is it's a street that's intentionally doesn't have enough room for two-way traffic, but accommodates two-way traffic. And what they suggest is the cars yield to let the other one go by, and there's enough intermittent parking to provide that good friction. But the street's usually anywhere from 22 to 26 feet wide. And so when you do the math on that, it's a parked car on each side, 6 to 7 feet. You're left with anywhere from 11 to 14 foot lane width, which can't fit two cars through very easily. So the cars slow down if there's brakes in the parking, and it works. It's a great neighborhood street type. It works in a very connected street network, and it works when the speeds and volumes are intentionally low. So there's certainly a street network, and there's a land use component to that street type. That's a long-winded way to get your question of the first pushback we get on that street type is from fire, who will often say that, well, we need at least 20 feet clear on all streets in case we need to set up apparatus. And so there's some mixed priorities, I think, in that and maybe some misinformation on what's actually essential versus not. But that's usually where we run into the biggest pushback from the fire department, is they tend to not prefer those really narrow streets. I don't know, since we aren't necessarily going to be rebuilding curbs, I don't know that we would ever get to a point where we'd want them that narrow for you all. But I mean, it's a preference, and they can work. But we could expect to have to facilitate something with fire on that. Other than that, I think most of the things we're talking about are pretty well accepted by fire departments. I think the other time they get concerned is when we start to talk about traffic calming features, and that's usually done on a street that was designed for too high a speed to start, and so we put things in to slow them down, like speed bumps or things like that fire departments really tend to not like, because there's going to be times when they need to be going as fast as they can. And so that's another challenge with fire. There's probably other situations I'm thinking of, but those two jump to the top of my mind as the ones where we get the most pushback from fire department.
Michelle?
All right.
Oops, sorry, I had to unmute. Quick question, actually, this is probably more for staff. The most recent development that I can think of is the development, is it Iron Horse or right off of Dartmouth? And I was just curious as to what we put in their PUD for, how wide their streets are, and do they have detached or undetached sidewalks and that sort of thing, just out of curiosity, real quick.
Yeah, those streets are actually private streets, maintained by a metropolitan district. So
that's right, yeah.
That really wasn't decided through their PUD for us.
Wade, sorry, but with that, wouldn't the fire department typically review their development plan? And
Yes, they would. Yes. And I know they were looking recently at removing some parking spaces for access to hydrants and so forth. And I know our fire marshal went out there and worked with them on that as well. So, yes. Any other questions or anything for this topic? Otherwise, I don't know. I don't want to put you on the spot, Chris, but I know our next topic is sustainability. I don't know if there's any sort of prompting questions we can throw out there tonight to prepare for our next meeting, or anything like that.
No, I don't mind being put on the spot with we haven't developed the presentation yet, but I will give you a hint so that you all are kind of thinking more broadly. When we do development codes, we think of sustainability in three ways. Is it green buildings and sites? In other words, things that are promoting either low energy or low impact site design, which we would expect it would be, but there will be a question of how much do you regulate for that versus how much do we just try to make sure there's not barriers to doing it should someone choose, because there could be some cost implications. Is it more of a complete community green and sustainability? In other words, the more walkable we are, and the more multimodal we are, regardless of whether we have green buildings or sites, we're going to be accomplishing more from a sustainability standpoint than we would be by having a bunch of green buildings? Or is it a third aspect to it of green in terms of economically viable and sustainable, that kind of return on investment, resilient, long-term? I mean, the 200-year sustainability, are we building things that pay for themselves and return on our investment in infrastructure, and or is it all three? And just when we are faced with our policies are pointing us to all three, there's certain things that we would regulate for and certain things that we would simply remove barriers so that they can happen. And that's about as far as we've thought about it, but we'll start to try to flesh those out. I do think the topic you talked about last time, the electric vehicles in the parking lot, it was related to the parking discussion, but it's exactly the type of green alternative energy site design and transportation thing that we need to be thinking about. And it does present some questions of, are we requiring those in certain parking lots? You guys already started to address some of that. Are we requiring them? Is there a threshold of a project where we would require them? Do we merely make sure we can accommodate them, or what combination of those? So I think that kind of thinking runs through a lot of the sustainability topics, and we'll try and frame them a little more succinctly. If you have ideas and things that you want covered, be sure to float them to Wade, and we'll make sure we incorporate those into the presentation.
Michelle?
Not, there we go. Just you saying those things about the electric vehicles and things like that. I think what we need to probably put into our plan is, and I don't know, maybe it's something that will just happen on its own, so it doesn't really need to be in a plan. But as we move forward with more and more electric vehicles and electric charging stations, at some point, the city's not going to, or the home or the landlord's not going to want to pay for all those electric vehicles charging on their dime. So at some point, there's going to have to be kind of like with the, the Lime scooters or something, where people can pay to have their vehicle charged instead of just leaving them there on somebody's free dime.
I don't have an electric vehicle, but it seems like I've seen those around town in different parking garages where they're in someone's parking garage, a commercial facility, but they don't just give you the electricity for free. You pay through an app or something like that for what you do use. So kind of maybe a third party model.
I was at a bank today, and they had a couple of spots with a charging station. And yeah, I don't know how that will all work. I think it'll be part of it will be the market, and perhaps part of it will be, whatever regulations. And I think it's a very interesting topic.
I would totally agree.
Yes, at the least, I don't think a landlord would be required in any situation to provide it out of the goodness of their heart. Multifamily might be different because you live there, but as far as commercial buildings, I don't think a landlord would be required to give you the electricity for free. I think it might be the market that would take care of that. And I think also Excel got permission to install a whole bunch of chargers that they could then, charge you for the electricity.
Well, I didn't mean my comment to sidetrack the conversation, but it was just something that popped into my mind. So I'll turn it back to you, Chris.
No, that's good conversation. Those thoughts have been running through our head as well. And I think the last point is where we usually see it. There's a third party that has a profit motive that has an interest in being on that property, and the energy companies are usually the ones behind those, I think, at least for the demonstration projects as we're rolling out, and who knows, it might evolve into a different economic model the more prominent they become.
And one of the other topics in sustainability that we're seeing more and more of is at the staff level is solar. And, we have 300 plus days of sunshine here in Colorado. And there's been a lot of talk about how we can capitalize on the solar aspects. And some of you will have been part of the conversations about solar and bulk plane and height. And so those are also some things that, we're hearing quite a bit of on the staff level. So that'll probably be part of the conversation going forward as well.
Christine?
I'll be interested in the conversation in that next meeting as far as site-specific sustainability for what would be required for all new construction versus what would be where you might try to get a certain number of points or pick from a certain number of options like they did in Golden. Although I heard that Golden is currently updating theirs, evolving it since it's a number of years old. So I guess if we do look at Golden's, we should make sure that we get their latest and greatest rather than look at yesterday's news.
I'm just, I think tonight's topic was great, and I just wonder if there's any more discussion on it in terms of street design. I just find that a fascinating topic. And Bernie, I don't know if you're out there, but I always respect your opinion. And as many people in this group, I respect many of these opinions. But I don't know if you have anything to add to that, to our street discussion, street design discussion. But yeah, it's just throwing that out there.
Go ahead, Bernie.
And then where they pulled the goal. Hi. I think that one of the things that I've seen as a trend in new street standards has been obviously the narrowing of the right-of-ways and including a lot of the amenities that we've been talking about in multiple ways. And I think that all works really well for main streets, whether they're arterials or collectors or others. I would like to see the street standards really taken a look at for new development on the residential side, similar to what the Ironworks was if those streets were to become public. In other words, what can we do? What is the future of our fire department and their equipment? And can we start to look at a lot of projects, I think, are held up by more than you think by the street standards. And sometimes the street standards don't necessarily accommodate for infill solutions, smaller new communities, new developments, things of that nature. And I know, in cities like Toronto, and I believe in Seattle, they've really looked at these street requirements, which were being driven primarily by fire, and they've come up with a lot of really interesting alternatives for those. So while the majority of our streets are in place, and yes, we will be building within the confines of the existing infrastructure, I think there's always going to be opportunities for streets. And I think a lot of times we default to to private streets because they don't necessarily fall in line with the street standards. So I know that's usually part of a PUD development, but it would be nice to have some of these standards so that if someone was going through an exercise of trying to do a land plan and presenting that as a new development, at least we know that they could use some of these new street standards, which maybe have some trade-offs and some alternatives that are not currently in the code.
Thanks, Bernie. Sorry for putting you on the spot there, but always have some good input.
Well, thank you, bro.
I got a comment on the ironworks area up there. I was up there and drove down their street, and there was cars that were parked less than a foot from one another. And I don't see how it would be even possible to get them out of the parking space there. And the street was just totally lined with these cars. And it was basically fairly tight to drive through that street. There's no way a ladder truck could get in there, and probably even a small fire truck could not get in there. So I'm not sure how they're really working that up there. But that's a real, the parking up there is really tight. At least it was when I was up there a few months ago. So I just wanted to throw that out there. One question I got is the sustainability that will be on November 2nd meeting.
Yes, that's the plan.
Okay. Yeah, the thing that I was talking about earlier in the meeting, that phase 1 questionnaire, it was on the third item that was on the agenda for tonight, the UDC assessment, parking and walkability under the what we heard. And they talked about the questionnaire under that topic. So I'm not sure, we never got to that, and it's not going to be talked about. So I'm not sure what that even is.
Yeah, thanks, Carl, for bringing that back up. And what that actually is was a questionnaire we did last summer during the assessment project. And that questionnaire is actually in the appendix of the assessment report. And I am happy to send that to everybody tomorrow morning, just so you can see what that references again. So yeah, thank you again for bringing that back up. But that's what that was.
Yeah, I'd love to see that. I'd appreciate it.
Sure.
Thank you.
One of the other attachments on the agenda tonight was the link to Englewood Engaged walk and wheel update plan. So if you all have a chance to take a look at what work's being done under that effort as well, that's I'm going to provide you with some ideas as to what the city is looking at with regard to projects coming up in terms of bike lanes and so forth. So that's something that's some good information as well. So also just wanted to remind everybody that on the Code Next Englewood Engaged page, you'll also find some documents related to our neighborhood preservation survey that's been conducted. The city's undergoing a historic preservation survey plan process right now. So you'll be able to see some interesting information in terms of, eras of some of the houses when they were built and that sort of thing. And once we get into the discussion about neighborhood character and design, that information is going to really come into play in our discussions as well. So just take a look at that, but that's also on the Englewood Engaged webpage as well for you all to take a look at. So just wanted to remind everybody that those pages are out there for everybody to look at as well. Everybody's quiet, so we must be at the end of our meeting. Last chance, anybody? Oh, Kate.
I was just trying to wrap my head around then with the street design standards or the idea of adding those in. Is this something then we're going to revisit, or we'll put in suggestions and then we'll review those later? I was just trying to figure out kind of what the next steps are with this discussion.
Yeah, I'll take that first, I guess, and then defer to Wade. But I think we would envision kind of coming back with something that sort of sums up this conversation, similar to what we did with parking, to stop short of what are the standards. And then I wouldn't, when we get to the broader public engagement that's going to kick off after these conversations wind up, we do have a scope element reserved for looking at particular issues in a case study or practical application format, and perhaps street design is one of those. So you might see some of these issues come up again in a scenario of either case studies or what ifs on a certain segment of the community. And then that would set us up for drafting actual code responses for you to react to as well. So you're likely to see this issue probably one or two more times before we even had a proposed regulation solution.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I'll just add to that in terms of, part of the other aspect of this group is a technical advisory group that does include our traffic engineer and public works. So keeping in mind the importance of everything and all the documents talking to one another, we will engage them more fully in the conversation at that time as well. So we know we're not doing something that is not possible here in terms of streets and whatnot. So.
Kate, I'll add one thing as well. Most of the streets in the city of Englewood have a 50 or 60 foot right of way, which can quite frankly be quite adequate. It really can. And then obviously arterials and some other streets have a wider right of way, but I think things can be accomplished. I think the discussion on moving curbs or not moving curbs is important because a lot of things can be done from flow line to flow line. But yeah, I think Wade's comments about engaging public works and our technical sort of committee, and we've got a lot of goals here, but I think it can be accomplished. So it's good comments.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Chris. Great presentation and information. And we will plan to see everybody at the next meeting. And again, I'm going to plug Englewood Engaged. Go there and look at the information. If you have anything else, just don't ever hesitate to contact me as well. We'll get everything loaded that we can and questions answered that we can. So one last thing too is that November 1st, we will be having our first review with City Council. So we will be giving them an update as to everything we've been doing and talking about and what our process is going forward. So that update is coming to them as well. Otherwise, thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of the night.
Wade, I got one quick one.
Sure.
The solar access guide I was looking at this afternoon. It's only a 3-page document, but it's very informative. It gives a sun angle at December 21st, and it talks about solar fences where it's the distance from the property line to your building, what kind of distances you need in there, but it's pretty interesting. It's a solar access guide, and it had a section 9-9-17. I'm not sure what that is, but there is a lot of information on solar access and the right on the websites. And I think we really do need to add a lot of solar information to our UDC.
Okay.
That's all.
Do you know if that's is that a building code reference, or who's the author of that document?
It talks about a solar fence, and I went over it pretty quick, and I think what that is the sun access from your property line and they give a height of certain feet. So I imagine it's the shadow area.
Okay, I'll take a look at it.
Across property. It was pretty interesting.
Great. Okay, thanks for the info. I'll take a look. All right, take care, everybody.
Right, thank you.